Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. It's been a while since I've been in here doing a podcast, and I have a treat for you today. I have Jessica Hockett in the hot seat, and we're going to have a conversation about student grading at the K through 12 level. This is an important conversation for everybody to listen to because there are multiple school districts in Illinois and elsewhere that are changing the way that they grade students from what we've traditionally been used to. You know, the grading scale, A through F, anything below a 60% is an F. Well, all of that has been upended and changed. And it hasn't just happened because of COVID. These changes have been happening for quite a while. The way that I was first alerted to this is when I looked at the Glen and Bard School District, D87, they started to just give 50% credit for work not turned in. I thought, I've never heard of this before. Well, believe it or not, it's very much a common practice. Now, the reason that Jessica's in here is because she happens to be an expert in this particular area of education. Jessica, according to your background, you were a teacher. Mm-hmm. You were a teacher of teachers. Mm-hmm. You've been a consultant to school districts. And in fact, you actually taught a course with the University of Virginia online on grading itself. Mm-hmm. So when I called you about this, I kind of wanted your response about this grading policy. And listen up, folks, if you're listening to this podcast, she doesn't necessarily agree with my position on them changing so drastically the way that we grade students. She's got a lot more nuanced opinion about this. And so we're going to get in this rapid discussion about that. I'm going to turn first to what the conversation was in our local school district. And Jessica and I's children are in the same local school district. That's the Wheaton Warrenville CUSD 200 school district. And just on their March 8th meeting, they had a full discussion about changing their grading policy. Now, they admitted in that discussion that they had been doing elements of this for a few years now, kind of testing it out, letting teachers decide. Well, now they've put in a formal policy about the grading, and this is for the high schools on what they're going to do. That grading policy includes, and if you want to, you can look at my screen if you're watching this online. We're going to pop up my screen right now, and I'll give Jessica a copy of the slide that I'm showing. But this is the slide that they showed, and I want your response to this, Jessica. So they show that there's a traditional percentage scale, 90 to 100. For an A B is 80 to 89, a C 70 to 79, a D 60 to 69, and then an F is 0 to 59%. And below and next to it, which I didn't quite understand until I had a conversation with you, they marked it off as 11 levels, 10, 10, 10, and 60. And now they have changed that to where you have minimum grading levels that are different. And that 50% where you have an F, that comes in because they are now saying that if a student, and this is what I have a problem with, not so much maybe their grading levels, that if a student turns in no work at all, they're going to receive a 40% minimum grade. If a student does partial work or makes a marginal attempt at the work, they'll receive at least a 50% grade in a particular project or test. And they're allowing for multiple retakes throughout the semester to improve that grade. You say that's okay.
You know, it is okay. I did watch this board meeting, this segment that you told me about. I hadn't seen it, but when you called me, you said they're changing their grading policies, and I said, okay, what are they changing? I went back, I watched the meeting, and I have to say that a lot of what our local school district is doing is not new. It's not new for school districts nationwide. Mm-hmm. I would say a lot of these things have been implemented in various forms for the past maybe 15 or so years. Just depends where you're at. Okay. But I thought the district did a great job of saying, like, look, teachers have very, very different grading practices between them. There are a lot of things that parents are used to because they were students for many years themselves, but there's a lot of inconsistencies between teachers in the way that they grade. Sometimes grading becomes more about, or your grade in a class becomes more about compliance right? Instead of, okay, this is an indication of how well you performed relative to standards. And so they said, since 2008 or 2009, we've been trying to move toward what I would call getting rid of some of the error and bias in grading and trying to establish more consistency. So one of the things they did talk about, although they didn't explain it all that well, is this idea that we have like a percentage scale, right? That's usually based on points of 0 to 100%. And we take that scale and we artificially impose letter grades over it. And we say 0 to 50% or 0 to 59% is an F and then a D and so on and so forth. But that scale is it's not equal intervaled, right? If you picture a pie, it's a pie that's not divided into equal segments. You have over half of that scale weighted toward one grade, which is an F. So if a student, for example, doesn't turn something in and gets a 0, it's almost impossible mathematically sometimes to recover from that because it pulls your grades all the way down. So a lot of districts have moved towards something more mathematically honest and saying like, look, there's a difference between a kid failing on something, like you tried and you stunk at it, right? Or you failed at meeting the standards, versus you didn't turn it in at all. So how can we make that artificial scale a little more equal? Does that kind of make sense?
Okay, I'm going to
Ideally, they wouldn't use percentages and points at all. It would be more like college with like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Do you see what I'm saying? And
like
doing
they do
it that
with an
way.
AP course.
Right. Yes,
based on your knowledge,
right.
you get a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1
And that's how
on an
you would
AP
mark
course
different
grade.
assignments
Yes.
and weight them. So, but in the meantime, it's really hard for people to get away from like the points. You got this many points out of this many points, and then we're going to call that this grade. Instead of
Okay, so are
evaluating
you
it
saying that I was
holistically.
unfairly graded at West Point? I mean, was I unfairly graded
Well,
in the past?
I don't know how West Point grades. I mean, we think about like law school, for example, right? In law school, a lot of times you don't even have papers or what we call formative assessments along the way. You have this
And by the
class
way-
and an exam at the end, and that's it, right? It's all riding
And
on
you
that
have a
one
PhD
thing.
in this.
Yeah, I mean, related to this, yeah.
Yes, you have
yeah.
a PhD related to this. So this is what you've been studying and you know about.
Yeah, I mean, so
And presumably you got, A's.
Yeah, I mean, and
how
it's-
were you graded?
And it's true when you weight the grading a percentage scale more toward an F, it's really difficult for kids to recover. There's not a lot of meaning in a 0 versus a 50%.
That's
like an
where
F is an F is an F, right?
Okay,
like,
that's
doesn't
where I want
matter.
to push back a little bit. Okay, I can understand having some mercy on
Sure,
kids.
sure.
Maybe they're going through a bad time. Maybe they're sick, had an extenuating sickness, whatever it might be, right? The issue here is that they get multiple retakes. So if you literally get 40% for not turning in any work when you have the opportunity to turn that work in later, to retake it, and maybe even retake it 2 or 3 times, which, by the way, it didn't seem like there was any consistency on the number of retakes that they're going to be allowed, but that's going to be more individualized, both between the student and between various teachers. When that occurs, you not doing a test, and they're not talking about this for homework assignments, by the way. That was also part of the discussion, that this had nothing to do with homework. That in a homework assignment, which is only, by the way, capped at 10% of your grade, they're capping what your homework is in the overall grading scale. And you can still get a 0 for homework, and that cannot be made up necessarily, or maybe it can be made up. But so for a major project, a major test, I decide I'm just not going to take it. I'm going to get a 40%. I know kids. I had one of them. You know what? I'm okay with my B.
Sure.
I don't need to take that last test because I'm still going to be like
Sure.
right at the 80. So the fact that they can make it up and they still get a 40% for not doing it says something entirely different. When it's not an extenuating circumstance, they intentionally decided not to do the work.
Sure. So there's two things about that. When I understood when they were talking about retakes, I understood that they were talking about retaking a test. And this is something that, for example, at my son's high school, they do as well. And so you are allowed to retake a test if you got a certain grade on it. But there are some steps that you have to take before you retake that test. Specifically, you have to turn in some practice or some other things to show that you have actually remediated, right? Your understanding on that. And then when you retake it, you're not retaking the same test, you're retaking a different form of that test. And I saw both of those things in the District 200 policy as well. I didn't see anything about late submission of a project.
But that is definitely going to be part of this deal, because it has to be. It's one of the major grading points for a summative assessment.
Is a project, right?
Yes, they say test papers projects.
Right.
So that would mean that a test paper or project would qualify as a retake. In addition, you don't have to take the entire test, is my understanding. You can take a portion of the test that you did not do particularly well on.
Sure.
But we know that's not what life is like. That's not how standardized national tests are done either. Retaking, you usually have to retake the entire test, because there is a time element to knowing this stuff sufficiently that you can quickly do it. Are we now going to get rid of timetables tests?
Right.
I think that is very informative to a student's ability to manipulate in their mind very quickly, knowing the basic facts. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but as a mother of 5, this is what I've observed.
Sure. I mean, the driver's ed test, can't you retake certain sections of it, right?
Well,
in the state of Illinois, should you be able to?
You be able to?
With projects, sometimes project deadlines are flexible. Certainly, you can file for an extension on your taxes. When I get feedback on things, maybe for work, maybe it is on just a particular section, and then I get to have the chance to redo it. I think the key in all of this is what is a grade? What does a grade mean? And for different teachers, it can mean different things. There's a lot of error that can creep into the grade where it becomes more about compliance and behavior. So we don't want an A just to mean I checked all the boxes versus I have a really good mastery or understanding of the concept. And another change that...
Okay, so that goes to a different part, I believe, of grading. And that is an objective versus a subjective standard. And that is, I agree, there is inherently unfairness in that, especially when it comes to writing particular papers. I certainly recall when it came to do an argumentative paper, the teachers essentially saying, I don't want to read a paper about guns. I don't want to read one about abortion. I've heard those arguments before. I'm tired of reading those papers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe she also has a bias.
Right. Well, when she's evaluating your paper, she shouldn't just put, and most teachers do this now, but there should be rubrics that are developed that provide some degree of consistency in evaluation and make it clear to the student what the standards are and what the quality standards are for whatever it is that they're doing. But I think what districts have tried to do is kind of wean, so to speak, teachers off of practices that they experience themselves as students, that they think of as mathematically fair and perfectly fine, that when you subject them to closer scrutiny, it's like, this doesn't really make sense. So one thing you alluded to that District 200 is doing, and a lot of districts do this, is they say, okay, with a grade, a teacher needs to consider if an assignment or a task or a test or a project or whatever is more formative in nature, like it's something that the student is doing along the way as they're learning, like math homework is a good example, or more summative. It comes at the end of a learning cycle, and it's the teacher saying, okay, we've done some practice, we've learned some things, you've played around with these concepts now, or facts or ideas or whatever, now show me what you can do, whether it's on an on-demand test, whether it's a paper, whether it's some kind of a complex project, right? And so what a lot of districts have done is say, look, summative is more representative of what you actually learned in the end and what you know now.
Yeah.
And formative is more about that practice. So formative assessments and tasks shouldn't really be heavily weighted in the grade. It should be more heavily weighted toward summative. So what this district has done is said, okay, 90% of the grade is going to be weighted towards summative assessments, and 10% is going to be formative. Those percentages are a little high, skewed for my taste. I would maybe say 75 or 80% should be summative, and 10 to 15% to 20% should be formative. So that is one critique that I would make about that. I think 90-10 works for math really well because of that daily practice, but in other subject areas, the formative assessments are usually a little more maybe substantive than that, or you do them over a course of several days. So that is a critique that I would make. But they're correct in that balance.
So how many retakes should a kid get? And I mean, should they still get a 40% if they've been given the opportunity to replace that work undone? I mean, we're talking you've done nothing.
Yeah,
you have literally not turned in a paper.
Yeah, I think so. I think a 40% is fine because it's still an F. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's still a zero, whether it's a 0, a 10%. You're assigning an F to all of those. So putting a 40% in as a placeholder that's not going to make that big of a difference. I mean, one thing we know from decades of research is that a 0 on something isn't the motivator. It isn't the weapon that teachers and parents assume it is. It is for a certain group of kids, for kids who get good grades, right? They're like, oh my gosh, a 0, right? I mean, some of those kids are like, oh my gosh, a B. So the threat of a 0 can be really motivating to them. But for kids who are, not turning in work for other reasons, right? There's other maybe behavioral reasons or academic reasons. The 0 does not motivate them necessarily to do better.
Are they doing this, obviously, they've not imposed this new grading logistics, is what they call this. They've not imposed it on the younger grades. This is for the high schools at this point. So is there something to be said, though, that, because I personally think that this still breeds bad habits for them going on to college. Is there something to say that the high school learning environment should prepare them for a college learning environment? And to what degree is this detrimental to that?
I mean, I have 4 college degrees, and I have to say that in most of my classes, like there I don't know, but not necessarily retakes, but there was a lot of stuff that was more project based and paper based. I mean, it was. I mean, the high stakes test, maybe in my intro classes, right? But
my gosh!
It was not as much. It was more about complex performance and your skills and bringing things together, not like not filling in the bubble on a multiple choice test, which I'm not opposed to, by the way. And I agree with you. There is something to be said for, time restricted. This is one time. A final exam is like that. Right? A final exam is like okay, you at this point you either know it or you don't. But along the way, is it about learning, or what is it really?
It's about both.
It is
about both. Yeah. It is about paying attention to what's important at your life. I mean, for some kids, maybe basketball is their most important thing. Whatever. But you're going to school 6 hours a day. Why? Because we depend on an educated society to bring peace and prosperity for the rest of the nation. Yeah. We can't have a lot of folks who don't know fundamentals, right? So education is really important. If you want to say that that's not what school is about, I disagree. School is about education in the end. All right. Now. Okay,
but we don't want to let school get in the way of an education, right? They're not synonymous.
I agree with that. They're not synonymous either, but there's a purpose behind people understanding and knowing particular things.
Sure.
I got to say, your college experience is 100% different from mine at West Point. Sure. I mean, what we went through at West Point, and which they still go through today, is honestly, you could have gotten demerits if you showed up unprepared for class.
Sure.
If you couldn't show that you did your homework, the instructor, they often didn't, but they could have given you a demerit.
Sure.
We grew up under the Socratic method where right now, if you were to do this in some classrooms, I think it would be a cause to say that the teacher is bullying you. We did something that was called taking boards. You would, every class in the math class, it was a famous thing at West Point, you took boards. Everybody in the, they had mapped out on the board in the classroom, everybody had their own chalkboard, right? Their own sort of division amongst these larger chalkboards. And you were told to go to the boards and everybody's going to put problem 15 on the board. Show me your work, everything. And then the instructor's going to pick one person to explain how'd you get your answer to the rest of the class. And if you hadn't done problem 15 for your homework, and you can explain, yeah, it was a little bit embarrassing, honestly. But you did learn from that because you had to explain your work verbally.
Right.
They don't do anything like that, not even close. And
they were online for a year and a half and not in,
but they're not even doing that
so
now.
So we're talking about motivation.
They don't even do that now.
Right.
You know what my point is that there's value in that. There's value to having. We never had retakes.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. Well, what I think what would be interesting, and all school districts should do this, certainly District 200, and it sounds like they're doing a little bit of this, is actually documenting the effect of these policies. With the retake policy, who does it tend to be? Right? Do kids actually retake, and then how did they do on the next test? Right? Does the ability to retake influence their grade and their motivation in the class in a positive way? I know I had students when I was teaching, actually even in graduate school, when I was teaching those courses, I had students like this. They'd actually rather not turn in the work and take the 0 and take the F than for you to be like, oh no, you're doing this. Now you have to go after a kid like that, right? But it was really, in my experience, kids were few and far between who were persistently not turning in work, persistently taking advantage of opportunities to have an extended deadline on a project. And as a teacher, I had systems for all of that. But it's not. I found that when these kind of policies in place, the outliers are going to be outliers no matter what, and then you work within that. And it's also the case that I've seen, I think it's Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland put a lot of very so-called progressive grading things in place at all grade levels. And I know that they had to, or ended up kind of scaling some things back or just modifying them to be a little bit more practical, because it's great theoretically and you can defend it mathematically, but in practice, here's what ended up happening. So we're going to try to modify that a little bit. And I think that's fair, and District 200 said this, a lot of districts do when they're trying to introduce new grading changes. They know what they're up against, and they know there's going to be a learning curve, no pun intended. And so I'm mostly okay with the changes that this particular district has introduced. I know, right? I mean, this is for the people who say I'm always after the school district, right? I'm
Jessica Hockett.
Yeah, I know.
Are you going to give public comment on this one?
I should.
You might want to give him an attaboy.
I might want. Actually, I would give some feedback on that 90-10. But
I'm still skeptical because at the end of the day and at the end of the conversation, and by the way, you can look at this conversation if you're listening to this podcast. You can watch their discussion of it. It's about a half hour long. It was their March 8th meeting. You can find it on the District 200 website. They throw up some slides, not just this one that I've shown you, but other ones. But at the end of the discussion, during some of the questioning, they admitted, though, this is really for diverse learners.
Well,
this is really a policy aimed at helping our diverse learners. And that just, boom, it's like,
yeah.
Okay.
So for me, there are a lot of, actually Oak Park River Forest was another district that did something last year with respect to grading. I'm not going to remember specifically what it was, but they justified it by saying, this is about, helping kids from minority background and making sure that our grading practices are equitable. That that may be the case, but I would say that like equity or differences in performance between kids from different socioeconomic backgrounds, for example, that's not really the main reason that we do these things. There's a lot of things that teachers do with grading that are just mathematically indefensible, or from an assessment standpoint, don't really have a lot of integrity or rationale. So that for me should be the lead, not we're doing this because of the low performing kids. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, on that note, just as a little bit of a response there, I will say that to me, this sounds like a hell of a lot more work for teachers, especially if they have to keep track of retakes and what'd you do in the interim to qualify for a retake, and then preparing a retake test, and then moving the grades from a 0 to a 40 to a whatever. And it just seems to me like it adds a lot of more hours to a teacher's day to actually do all this. But I wanted to go on one last note before we end this podcast. There was this interesting Jonathan Turley article, and it's called "The New Normal: New York to Lower Math and English Proficiency Standards Due to Poor Test Results." And he says, I recently wrote how public educators and unions were methodically killing public education. The best example this week comes from New York, where a school board committee has solved the dismal math and reading scores for children in the system. They lowered the standards. This is not the first system to gut its standards rather than improve its quality of education. As teachers and unions object to school choice, they continue to make the case for private education. Parents are increasingly voting with their feet. The board is simply calling the lack of proficiency the new normal and changing the standards. What say you?
Yeah, I think that's a bad idea. I think it's a vicious cycle where, you know, and I don't know the specifics in New York, but if
I did send you that article ahead of time.
Yes, you did. They've seen.
I want to let my audience know that.
I'm saying in the bigger picture. I don't know all the stats on how many kids have left the public system in the past couple years, you know, since the pandemic response. I think it's probably a good portion nationwide. It's a healthy number of kids. And so I think what happens too when you have kids leave the public system for private or for homeschool, your performance gradient, so to speak, changes, and then that can lead you to do exactly what they're doing, is be like, well, we have to lower the standards, but it's not helping those kids.
Yep.
But you know, again, we made some choices in 2020 and 2021 that you know, some people would call, I would call, to use the far left's term, systemic racism, right? When we closed schools and locked kids out and put them on screens, right?
100%.
So for me, this isn't the grading conversation and the role of grading on motivation, and is this going to affect kids' motivation? I mean, there are things that have happened in the past few years to kids that I think are a far greater burden on their motivation than, you know, allowing you to take a retake on a test.
Okay, I'm totally going to agree with you that, because you know, as he writes and as we have seen elsewhere too, there's been the elimination of gifted and talented programs to achieve equity by artificially lowering everyone to the same level. Schools have eliminated the F to guarantee 100% passage rates. People have suspended proficiency standards to simply graduate students who cannot reach required levels. I mean, we've had shocking reports out this week too. WirePoints has done a number of them on the top 20 districts in the state, where you've got 95% graduation rates like you do in the Wheaton Warrenville school district, and you've got less than half the kids reading and doing math at grade level.
Right.
And so you have a total disconnect on some of this.
Which would be interesting. I don't know the stats for our school district, but you know, the correlation or the relationship between students' grades, the grades that they get, and then the performance on standardized tests, right? So is there a degree of grade inflation that is
we know that this
occurring?
is the case because there's one of my friends did a comprehensive study with D87's AP scores, and there's a whole lot of people that are taking AP classes because the superintendent thinks that that is like really important, that he has so many people taking AP classes. And I've increased the AP course participation rate. Those
But
kids
they don't
aren't
perform
passing.
on the test.
They don't perform on the
Right,
test.
which is performing on the test is the only way you get
exactly right.
college
So-
credit,
and
and
you're-
you can take the test
right.
without taking an AP course. Do you know that? That's what I did in high school.
Well,
by the way,
yeah,
before AP was a thing.
absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
So, yeah. I'm not
and
saying
my
I
kids
would condone that,
were
but-
beneficiaries of having AP courses in high school that they then subsequently got college credit for. So I'm not opposed to that. I think that's great.
Or some people
But I
would
think
say
it's-
just the rigor of the course,
That's
even if you don't pass the test and get the credit. Or there are
Okay,
also
but-
colleges now that are
right.
not even giving, like, who is it, Harvard, I think, or some of those schools. They're like, we're not, they don't even recognize like a 5 on the AP, because how could you possibly, replace one of their courses?
So
you see
West
that's
Point's
more
the
at
same
other
way.
end,
West
but
Point's the same
sure.
way. They don't recognize any AP test score. What they do is they will test you themselves on languages and math skills, and like you could test out of chemistry or not too as well, because they have
entrance exams.
Yes, yeah, and
almost,
so then you're just,
placement
but you don't.
tests.
Guess what? You test out of chemistry doesn't mean you take chemistry. You just take a higher level of it there.
Sure.
So
Sure.
and same thing with math. You're just kind of taking a higher level of math. Although my son did only have to take, I think, 1 year of math instead of 2 because he tested so high. So that's fine. But I mean, I'm okay with that.
I mean, I think the key with any of this, not just with grading, but with any policy changes, and I'm a policy person, that a school district makes, is that there's healthy discussion about it, public discussion about it, and that there's accountability and transparency for how the policy is working, right?
Yes.
And so that would be, the onus for that is on a school board. And by the way, please vote in your school board election that's coming up on April 4th, or beforehand, early voting.
Yes.
That and parents staying on top of it too, not just with their own children, but saying, hey, this retake policy, like, what's the data on that? How many kids in the math department at our high schools take advantage of retakes, and what does that look like? Do you see what I'm saying? That should all be part of it, not just we're putting this policy in place and that's it. There should be grading of the grading policy. Assessment of the grading policy.
Listen, I could talk to you all day about this stuff. It's terrific. Thank you so much for coming on The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. It's been a great podcast. I love that we sort of had a little bit of a disagreement here. That's great. You're the professional in this space. I'm sure our school district failed to even call you. They probably don't even understand that they've got professionals right in their midst, and they don't do that. But you can find out, you can follow Jessica's work at the nationalopportunityproject.org. She works for them right now on educational issues. So National Opportunity, it's nationalopportunity.org is the website. Is that correct?
Yep, correct.
Okay, great.
Correct.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me on The Real Story with Jeannie Ives.
Thank you.